you, Debbie. Excellent job as usual. You know, I wanted to thank Bob Morrissey, who sends out the schedule way ahead of time on when you have the prayer. And I want to thank our class members for really stepping up and getting back to him with responses and looking forward to the responsibility of presenting the class prayer. Now, I would also like to apologize for anyone who tried to get on Zoom this morning, as we do not have any internet services in the whole building. I think it's because of the storm maybe, and maybe some of you have power outages at home also. But, so there is no Zoom this morning, so you guys give yourself a pat on the back because you came in person, you're actually here, and you're gonna get a great lesson in just a few minutes. But you know, as we go through the day, I was looking for a poem before I have Nancy come up and introduce Sally, and I found the perfect poem. It's called Looking Good. My face in the mirror isn't wrinkled or drawn. My house isn't dirty. The cobwebs are gone. My garden looks lovely, and so does my lawn. I think I may never put my glasses back on. And with that, Nancy, come on up.
We are very fortunate to have Sally Dowland back with us. We always get a wonderful lesson. She has insights that only she has. We had a discussion about farming a little while ago, and she has put in her seeds for her garden. And so we're hoping now that the various animals that I'm sure you all are aware of don't attack the new growth that we hope we'll have soon. So we'll have to keep track and see how her garden grows. Come on up, Sally. Thank you.
Well, it's good to be back with you. It's always great to be here. But I had a little trouble this morning, well, not this morning, but in the last month, figuring out what I'd teach. So you're going to get something a little bit different than normal. I'm going to be sharing from a course that I was first introduced to in about 2006. And it's only thanks to your tech team that we're able to do this. So even though the Zoom isn't working because of church issues, hopefully my lesson will work because of your tech team. The course that I'm going to introduce to you today is called Serious Answers to Hard Questions. And I've recommended it to some of your members as worth a look, and if you had a week that you needed to fill something in, this is a good class to offer. And it was tentatively offered last fall as a drop-in after Wednesday night supper class. I don't know if it ever actually came to fruition. But it's a course that deals with 10 different issues that various people find to be barriers to faith. Things such as the differences between science and religion, or difficulties that some people have with the commands that God gives in the Old Testament. It's like, if God tells us to do that, I don't know that I want to follow a God like that. And it deals with those issues. Or some people have a real barrier to faith because they look back on the sins of the church. Things like the Inquisition and some of the modern day scandals that have happened in the church. And it's like, if that's who Christians are, I'm not sure I want to be a part of it. And so it deals with some of those issues. The class that I'm going to offer to you this week and next, I'm taking one lesson and splitting it in two, is considering the problem of evil. You know, there are some people that can't accept the concept of a good and loving God because of the reality of evil in the world. And there are others who believe in a good and loving God, but they don't know how to deal with evil or understand it, or, you know, how can they withstand it? You know, they know it's real, but it's a barrier to their faith, to their trust in God. We can look to some other religions and say, well, you know, how have they dealt with the problem? And, you know, some religions create the idea that evil is an illusion. It's not real. And so you just have to get to the place where you can rise above it and think that it's not real.
That would be a hard sell.
Yeah, that, you know, doesn't really work, but you know, it's out there. I saw a couple of people nodding who are familiar with religions like that. Other religions, if you go back to the origin stories of some of the other religions that are in the world, they say the world was created through a battle between good and evil, that you had these powers of good and powers of evil, and they engaged in a great battle, and creation was a fallout of that battle. And since you were having good and evil fight, part of the creation is evil. And you know, it's like it admits to the reality of evil in the world, but in those understandings, evil is equal to good. So we know that these are not Christian understandings of evil. Christians recognize that evil exists. I mean, all we have to do is look around, and evil exists. But we understand too that rather than rising above it or escaping from it, we need to learn how to withstand it or resist evil. We know it's not equal in power to God or God's love. And we know too it was not present as part of God's original creation. Yeah, Mike?
How would you define evil for us?
Okay, I'm gonna let our presenter this morning
Okay.
define that. And so the thing that I want to remind you of, you know, we understand that evil is real. It wasn't present in God's original creation, but it is present now. But we have the promise it won't be present in the new creation. You know, that's the hope that we look forward to, that God will wipe the tears from every eye. You know, there will be no sorrow. So we have something to look forward to. And to answer the question, to a certain extent, that Mike raised, you know, what is evil? We're going to hear from Dr. Kendall Swan. When this video presentation was developed, Dr. Swan was a professor of systematic theology at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C. Wesley created a whole series of courses through their Wesley Ministry Network because they said, you know, we're getting pretty good at teaching our preachers. We're getting much better at teaching those who come to seminary and helping them know, but somehow a lot of this learning isn't getting disseminated to the lay people in the church. And so they said, we're going to take these expert teachers and make it so it can go directly to the lay people in the church. And so they developed a series of courses, all of which that I've taught are really, really good. So Dr. Swan is now, he holds the Bishop Macbee and, let's see, I need to read this, Rose Y. Stokes Chair of Systematic Theology at Candler School of Theology. So he's a local boy now. What I hope is that his presentation, and it's about 12 minutes long, We'll give you some new ways of thinking about evil and withstanding evil. And maybe shake loose some ways you might think unwisely about evil. You know, because we can fall into habits of thought, and he'll mention a couple that I expect we've all been exposed to, that he says that's not really the best way to think about evil. You know how, and I've taught in here on Job, and we've talked about Job's friends, that they were telling him all sorts of stuff that wasn't really faithful to the God we know. And so we hope that it'll shake a little bit of that loose. And so the part about withstanding evil, I don't usually do this. But this is kind of a teaser. You gotta come back next week. Because he doesn't finish. We're only gonna watch half of Dr. Salen's presentation this morning. But he'll talk a little bit more next week about how we can withstand evil. So, Bruce, if you can, start the video.
Several years ago, I was on my way to work, and I saw something very strange. I saw a large gray commercial airliner descend from my field of vision at a horrible angle and disappear behind the rise in the highway. A few minutes later, I drove past the Pentagon, and I saw the whole side of the building black with smoke pouring from it. I saw people running across the road, in fact, some right in front of my feet. That evening, I learned that what I'd seen wasn't an accident. That the plane had been deliberately flown into the Pentagon, and many innocent people had lost their lives. I learned that what had happened had been done by people believing they were acting in the name of God. I also knew that in order to respond to what I'd seen, which I knew to be evil, I had to respond to it more than just out of my emotion and my instincts. I had to find a way of understanding what I'd seen in light of my Christian faith. I had to see the reality of evil in Christian perspective. A wise Christian theologian by the name of Christopher Morse likes to say that there's a big difference between understanding evil and withstanding evil. And Christopher Morse is right. And that distinction goes to the very heart of Christian faith. Because Christians don't claim that their Christian faith enables them to answer every question about evil that's ever been posed, or to understand all the evil that they encounter in life. Rather, the claim of Christian faith is that we are able to put our trust in a power that is able to withstand evil, and that is able to help us withstand evil even when we can't understand it. Indeed, the central claim of Christian faith is simply this: there is already in the world a power that is stronger than evil, and that is the power of God's love in Jesus Christ. Still, part of being able to withstand evil is understanding it insofar as we can. And that means knowing what we want to say about evil in light of Christian faith, but it also means being clear about what we don't want to say. For as the friends of Job show us only too well in the Bible, one of the most hurtful things that we can do is speak about evil unwisely and unfaithfully. I've often heard people try to make sense of the reality of evil in several ways that I believe are not faithful to the gospel. Perhaps you've heard some of these remarks as well. I've heard people respond to the reality of evil by saying, God willed it just as it happened. I've also heard Christians make sense of an evil event by saying it must have happened because God just wasn't there. Those two perspectives are almost contradictions to each other. And yet, I think that they have something in common. Neither of them is faithful to the way in which the scriptures portray God dealing with evil in the course of Israel's history, and above all, in the central figure of Jesus Christ. In the rest of this talk, we're going to look at evil in three different perspectives. We're going to look at how God relates to evil as the scriptures portray it. We're going to look at how the scriptures portray our human relationship to evil. And then we'll look at how Jesus Christ relates to evil. From that perspective, we'll go back to those two opening viewpoints that I think are unfaithful to the scriptural portrait, and we'll see if we can improve on them. We need to start, though, by asking an important question. What is it that we mean when we use the word evil? By evil, do we mean everything that causes us suffering and pain? Is good anything that brings us pleasure, no matter how trivial or shallow that pleasure may be? Well, we know that much of the suffering of the world does come from acts that we perceive and recognize to be unquestionably evil. And yet there does seem to be some measure of suffering in the world that is very difficult to trace back to any particular act of disobedience towards God. Consider an athlete who pushes her body to the next level of performance and experiences a great deal of pain in doing so. That's a kind of suffering. But is it evil? Think about growing pains or sending your child off to camp for the first time. You know that they're going to weep with feelings of terrible homesickness. But is that suffering evil? Every time we make a significant decision in life, we close some paths that were open to us before. And as we do so, we may sense a real sense of loss and regret. Is that evil? Karl Barth, the Swiss theologian, spoke about the shadow side of creation. And what Karl Barth meant by that was that, according to the biblical portrait, the world that God has made is a world that includes both the sun and the shadow, both day and night, both the seasons of spring and summer where life flourishes, and also fall and winter where life becomes dormant and quiet and even dies. Metaphorically, what this refers to is that the very world that God has made includes the possibility of some forms of human suffering. Possibilities of pain and suffering that are built into the very fabric of the world. If we wanted to avoid all possibility of suffering and pain in life, we would have to lock ourselves in our room. And even that would cause us pain and suffering. The fact of the matter is that the world God has made includes the possibility, indeed the inevitability, of some forms of suffering, and forms that may indeed contribute in the long run to our spiritual growth. Some, however, will be forms of suffering that we will wish we had never gone through. As I see it, the promise of Christian faith has never been that the faithful will never experience the shadow side of creation. The promise of Christian faith is that in the good times and in the bad, in the light and in the shadow, in the spring of life and in the winter, the Lord is a faithful God who keeps covenant with his people. Moreover, Christians look forward to the promise of a new creation, when even the shadow side of creation is a thing of the past, and God wipes away every tear from the eye. This brings us back to the question, what is it that we mean by evil? To understand evil in biblical perspective, we have to see it in terms of God's relationship to evil. According to the biblical portrait, God creates the world for a purpose, and humankind for a purpose. That purpose is to grow in trust and obedience towards God, to live in right relationship with other human beings, and to care for the natural world as responsible stewards. From the point of view of biblical faith, evil is nothing other than the rebellion of God's creatures against that good purpose. When human beings rebel against the goodness of God, they bring the reality of evil upon themselves. Evil corrupts the human beings in their relationship to God. It corrupts their relationships with one another. and it distorts their relationship to the natural environment and to the natural world. Evil is a distortion of the goodness that God intends for us. And yet, how does God in turn relate to our rebellion? The scriptures are very clear that God is the eternal and implacable foe of evil. And yet it's very important to understand that in the right way. The scriptures don't suggest that God is a petty tyrant who insists on having everything God's own way. No, God is opposed to evil because God is committed to the greater good on behalf of the creature. God's opposition to evil, therefore, is always tied to God's faithfulness and even God's mercy towards the evildoer. God expels Adam and Eve from the garden, but God also makes them skins to equip them for their new life in the wilderness. God judges Israel and yet preserves God's covenant, because the very judgment of Israel's wrongdoing is for the purpose of the greater good that God has in mind for Israel, and through Israel for the whole world. Who's responsible for this rebellion against God? The scriptures point the finger in one main place. The responsible character is humankind, the human family. It's also true that around the borders of the biblical portrait, the scriptures sometimes suggest that there are demonic powers, a Satan, also in rebellion against God. In thinking about that question, it's important to bear two things in mind. Even when the scriptures point to the reality of demonic powers in rebellion against God, they never take the issue of human responsibility away. The scriptures have no sympathy for the excuse, the devil made me do it. The other thing to bear in mind is this. Whether we trace back the rebellion against God to humankind, which is clearly the main concern of the scriptures, or whether we trace it back to humankind and rebellious demons, in either case, the root cause of evil remains the same. For the root cause remains the creature's rebellion against the goodness of God. The question is also raised, why is it that God has created creatures who are so prone to rebellion in the first place? Augustine and many other theologians have regarded this as one of the most difficult questions of all. Some have suggested that because God intended for human beings to respond to God's love with love of our own, therefore God created humans with the capacity of freedom, and that freedom in turn can be abused. And as it is abused, the reality of evil is introduced into the world. Evil is the cost of a world in which God wishes God's love to be responded to with our love. There may be something to that answer, and yet it seems to me it still leaves many questions unanswered. There are many children who've never had any meaningful opportunity to exercise freedom in their lives because of the wicked actions of many adults. Perhaps this is one of the places where the most honest answer we can give is, we don't know. But we do believe that God, having made us as we are, vulnerable to falling away from God, is able to reclaim the creature that God loves and triumph over evil in the end.
Okay. So, I'm so grateful that Dr. Salen ends this portion of the video with, there are some things where we have to say, I don't know. And some things we probably won't know until the resurrection comes. But let's talk about this a little bit. And I want to start with this concept of withstanding evil, because that's an important thing for us to deal with. one of the quotes from his presentation, he said, "There's a big difference between understanding evil and withstanding evil. And that distinction goes right to the very heart of Christian faith. Christians don't claim that their faith enables them to answer every question about evil that has ever been posed, or to understand all the evil that they encounter in life. Rather, the claim of Christian faith is that we are able to put our trust in a power that is able to withstand evil, and that is able to help us to withstand evil, even when we can't understand it." So as long as I'm doing stuff differently this morning, I'm gonna keep doing stuff differently. I want you to turn to a neighbor, find a study buddy, and talk about your response to the question I'm about to ask. In the book of Job, the righteous hero protests against unjust suffering, but he never really gets an answer as to why it's happening to him. You remember those powerful passages? Job says, "Just show up, God. I want to fight this out with you." And he never gets to have that discussion with God. What he gets, though, is an overwhelming experience of the power of God, before which he bows in humility and acceptance. So the question I'd like for you to talk about with your neighbor, just for a couple of minutes: if God empowers you to withstand evil that you still do not understand, is that enough? Go.
That's what Joe did. He had the she's not anything right You've been confused
Johnny, you're gonna tell us what is the correct answer?
Your correct answer is okay, let's come back together. Dave? Oh, okay, all right. Well, we're gonna move on. But if you want a take-home question, if God, let me read it so I say it the same way. If God empowers you to withstand evil that you don't understand, is that enough? And I had another question, is like, well, are you going to tell us the right answer? It's like, my answer is not your answer, and there is no right answer. But think about that. Are you going to be like Job before God appeared and kind of called him to account and say, this isn't fair? Let's, I need to defend myself, show up in court so I can, deal with you there. Or is it enough when God shows up and says, here's who I am, and all this understanding is way above your pay grade? And Job, for himself, said, oh, that's enough. Larry?
The problem that I have with this, not me, but I understand evil due to human agency. but Job's a good example. It was not due to his failures
Right.
or his not doing what was right.
Right.
It happened. And there are plenty of cases like an earthquake, for instance.
Right.
That's not due to human evil or
Right.
or agency. It's
Right.
through the
Yeah.
natural process.
Yeah.
So that raises the question, did God create evil? One.
Yeah.
And two, is it enough? We don't often have God come and restore us like Job got
Right,
restored.
right, yes. Yeah, and, and that kind of leads to, what Dr. Sullivan was saying about Karl Barth. That one of the ways to understand earthquakes, tsunamis, whatever, that aren't directly attributable to human evil is that creation has a shadow side. And that was a new concept to me when I was first introduced to it. I haven't read a heck of a lot of Karl Barth, but I've heard him quoted a lot. And so have a lot of respect for what he says. And that is one way to explain some of the suffering that goes on in the world. And I think the distinction between suffering and evil is important, that sometimes suffering is just part of life, but it's not necessarily evil. Now, a lot of suffering is directly attributable to evil that humans cause. But it's one of those big questions. And this is why, I said this is kind of a teaser. You have to come back next week because we learn a lot more about how to actually withstand evil. But as I was listening to this video again, I couldn't help but go back to one of those hymns that we sing pretty frequently, and I think with good reason, Trust and Obey. Evil is pretty much directly attributable to the rebellion of the creature against God's good purposes. Yep, Dave.
It seems to me that all evil, as I know it, is human generated.
Yeah, and pretty much that's where he went with it, and that's why I think he made that distinction between suffering isn't necessarily a result of evil. Suffering happens, and Barth explained it due to the shadow side of creation, that there are things that do just happen. But a lot of, pretty much, and Dave's saying all evil is attributable to this rebellion of the creature against God's good purposes. God said, live in relationship, right relationship with God. Live in right relationship with each other. Live in right relationship to God's good creation. Care for it. Nurture it, steward it. And what do humans do? Say, oh no, I know better. We've got to get to that point where we realize, no, I don't know better than God. Come on. Who is this God that we worship? Who is this God that we serve? Who is the God who wants the very best for us and tells us this is how you can receive the very best that I have to give? Yeah.
Hey Sally, I got a quick question.
Mhm.
Do you believe or you think, or maybe you can share your thoughts on, there are different degrees of evil? Is there slightly evil, more evil, colossal evil?
Years and years ago in my Sunday school class, we had a lesson on sin. Same question. Well, that was just a little sin. That one's a really big sin. It was like we were trying to grade the sins. Taking a bite of fruit. That doesn't sound like such an awful thing because God had said to Adam and Eve, go ahead, eat freely. This is for your sustenance. But God said, just don't eat from that tree. So they just did something that God had already invited them to do, except for one little mistake.
It was forbidden.
That one,
Was
God
forbidden.
said no.
Forbidden.
And so, it's like, it doesn't seem big, but rebellion against God, going against God's commands, God's intentions. It's like, yeah, it'd be hard to grade them, I think. Yeah.
Is war evil?
Huh?
Is war evil?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, that's one of those things. I have often, I tend to think that it is evil, and it's certainly in rebellion against God's commands to love your neighbor as yourself. But then there are times when, because we're living in a fallen, broken world, it appears to be necessary.
So little evil.
Well, it's one of the, and I hearken back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer on that. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, a powerful theologian of the 20th century and lived under Nazi rule. And he was imprisoned because he was caught in a plot to assassinate Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a devout Christian, tried to live a disciplined Christian life, chose to involve himself in a plot to murder. Thou shalt not murder. It's like, but, for him, he resolved it by saying it was for the greater good. It was for the protection of all the innocents who were being murdered by Hitler. So, there are places where we have to make a decision. And it's not easy. And there's a lot of I don't knows. But I think that for me, the takeaway from the video in not to speak unwisely about evil, when something evil is perpetrated on another person, not to say, well, it was God's will. I think that's a terrible place to go. Or, on the other hand, to say, God wasn't there. That's the only way it could happen. Because that's one of the obstacles to faith. People say, if God is a good and loving God, how could God allow that to happen? And I just, I go back to the fact that we do live in a fallen, broken world. And stuff happens due to our rebellion. So next week, we'll move on to his presentation about Jesus and evil, and how Jesus overcame evil. And, you'll get a little bit more. You're not going to go away understanding it completely. I'm still struggling with this. I was like, oh yeah, all these people here have great experience and they don't have obstacles to faith. But I was like, yeah, I'm still struggling with this one. And so I'm guessing that a few of you might be as well. And I think it's good for us to think about it every once in a while. And particularly if we can get more tools for withstanding evil. So if I can find my place, I have a prayer that I'd like to share with you. But I want to read one more quote before we go, because it's like, we live in a fallen, broken world. But hear this quote from Dr. Swan. The promise of Christian faith has never been that the faithful will never experience the shadow side of creation. And we all know that, right? The promise of Christian faith is that in the good times and in the bad, in the light and in the shadow, the Lord is a faithful God who keeps covenant with God's people. Join me in prayer. Oh God, we bring before you this day our doubts and fears about evil and its power in our world. We struggle to reconcile a good creation and the presence of so much wickedness within it. We wonder how we can affirm a God of power and love who does not stop evil from invading our lives. We ask you to open our minds to a fuller understanding of your nature and our hearts to a deeper experience of your presence, even in the midst of suffering. We ask this in the name of Jesus, in whom love and suffering meet. Amen.
Amen.
Excellent job, Sally. We look forward to next week. And I will share with you, I can't remember the exact date, time, but I know this happened back in Hawaii, and it was one of our priests was talking, and he had a sermon for the day, and he was talking about God and evil. And he said, there's one way you'll never forget it. And so he wrote on a chalkboard, G-O-D, and evil. He says, here's how you remember it. Take the last letter and move it over. Isn't that amazing? I mean, you know, I never forgot that. So if you take one letter and move it over, you get God and devil. I mean, he said, you know, there's two sides. He mentioned, you know, the light and the shadow. So there's a lot to look forward to next week. And of course, Wednesday, game day, right? Game day, 3 o'clock, game day.
Jeff,
Yes.
would you make the announcement that I?
Oh, sure. Okay, thank you. You know, come up for a second, Pat. Come on. You know, as we know, two of our great classmates, Gloria and Jack, have been relocated, but Gloria needs a little assistance. And Pat, would you be so kind as to tell people what we're looking for? Okay, a reference.
Yeah, they don't think that Gloria is getting as much therapy as she should be getting at the Benton House. And they were hoping that there may be a therapist that somebody could recommend that would do in-house, make house calls. And we don't know whether it'll work or whether she'll want it, but it's worth a try to try and get her out of the wheelchair, up and walking. So if you could just text me or call me or something if you have a recommendation, and I'll pass it on to them. Thank you.
And we appreciate all that you guys have been doing for our classmates. So again, they're looking for a physical trainer who does house calls, okay? So give Pat a call, send her a text, send her an email, and we'll work on that. And as we wrap up, you know, for today, our special prayers also for Mark, as he has a successful surgery. We pray for successful surgery on Tuesday. And a final reminder, if you have any type of requests for prayers, if you send it to Sue or you send it to me, we will get it in a newsletter and we will get it up on the slides, okay? So, now, gentlemen, tomorrow is a famous holiday in America, President's Day. Who can tell me the second president of the United States? My granddaughters all know. Come on, yeah, Adams is his last name. Thank you, okay, you know, it's kind of like who was the second man on the moon? Oh, you know, I mean, it's like, well, why is it we never remember who was second, right? I mean, it's amazing.
Ed Sullivan.
Ed Sullivan, right, there you go, okay. So, have a great week. Give somebody a hug today, okay? Have a great day. Aloha.
Thank you, Jeff.